Welcome back, Chapter 13, and the rise of modern nations. Ooh. All right, so one of the most important movements later in the Middle Ages was the development of several European countries into great nations with strong centralized government. This was most noticed in what became England, France, Spain, and Portugal, where the situation tended to push those individual groups into unity. By the end of the 15th century, the feudal states and free cities joined under very strong kings. The rise of these strong kings in Europe paved the way for modern progress and civilization, pushing for better law and order. Sometimes this proved good for the people, and sometimes these new governments became too powerful to actually be of any help to anybody else but themselves. However, before we forge our way into the rise of modern nations, let's take a look at some of the land and the seas that surrounds this lesson. Here we have an amazing view from NASA of the North Sea. Because of the spring sunlight that warms the Northern Sea waters, it causes the grass of the sea to explode into color. This grass of the sea is actually phytoplankton. Since we've looked at the North Sea, let's take a look at some of the British Isles land formations. They have beautiful moors, dales, peaks, hills, pikes, and gorges. Let's take a look. Once the Roman Empire started to crumble, Rome had to leave the British Isles, but not before Christianity had made its way over to the Celts, the original people who lived there. Well, as they celebrated their lessening of oppression, in invades the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes around the 5th century. Aww. Now, with that being said, let's fast forward to this week's lesson and start with Henry II. Let's take a look at what he looked like. Here's a picture of Henry II. He began his reign in 1154 as King of England. He is known for orchestrating the development of the common law and for trial by jury, rather than the popular trial by combat. Here's a picture of the castle he and Queen Eleanor lived in. Here is a picture of the Court of Common Pleas. Now this shows the pleaders and the clients standing in front of the 7 justices who are wearing red. Here's a picture of the common law legal system building that is stationed in England this day. So the common law system was gaining popularity with Henry's loyal subjects. On the other hand, the nobles, it wasn't flying with them, which didn't really matter to Henry, because part of the reason why he came up with the common law is to keep the nobles under bay. Well, you know how well that worked out. Another problem Henry was having was with the church in England, the Roman Catholic Church, okay? He wanted to put them underneath the common law system as well. And do you think that worked out? Do you think they're like, oh, sure, we'll be judged by you? No, they didn't. They rejected the idea and had a conniption fit. And they said, no, we will be ruled by the Pope and we will be judged by the church law only. Okay, once again, problems arose. And then Henry's knights took it upon themselves to murder Archbishop of Canterbury, causing the king to have to recant, back up, retract, pay penance to the Pope, reword some carefully guarded limitations concerning the church's legal freedom, just so that he would not be rejected publicly as the king. So common law is great for the common people, not so great and not happening for the clergy, and the nobles poo-pooed it. Let's take a look at King Henry II's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Despite all the writings of the beauty of Eleanor, the only lasting thing that we have of her is this life-size sculpture called an effigy. But as you read, she was quite the queen. First the Queen of France and then England when she ruled with Henry. She also ruled in her son's absence when King Richard I, also known as the Lion-Hearted, went away to fight in the Crusades in the East.
After Richard I's death, then his lovely brother, I want to say the evil Prince John, because all I think of when I was reading this section was Robin Hood and Maid Marian Disney style with the foxes. Anyway, okay, so after King Richard's death, Prince John took the throne and became King John. Okay. P.S. This is the prime example of too much power and how it wasn't good for the people, at first at least. Yet, as God chose to use this time and this king's actions to bring about one of the most important documents in history, and even though it was at this time actually technically only an agreement between the king and the nobles, it did set the stage for so much more. Let's take a look. But before we take a look, I need you to get a piece of paper out. Yes, it is time for the most favorite time, pop quiz. Okay, now that you got your piece of paper, go ahead and number it for 1, 2, we only have 4 questions, okay? So number 1, the Magna Carta means what? What does Magna Carta mean? They print it out in the video, it's fabulous. Number 2, who did the charter apply to? Was it for everybody originally or not? Who was it originally actually written for? Okay. Number 3, who made the charter invalid? Okay, they don't say it, but it was only good for 10 weeks and then it was null and void and invalid. But who said it was invalid? And 4, how old was Henry III when he took throne? After John died, Henry III took over. How old was he? Okay, now that you have your pop quiz questions, go ahead and watch your video about the Magna Carta and then come back to me. Sometime later, after the Magna Carta and that whole situation, another building block was laid for government. And it happened during the rebellion of the English nobles with their leader, Earl Simon de Montfort, against Henry III and against his taxing and his mistreatment of their own people. Now, during this time, the king had his council of men who would help him make decisions. Sometimes the king's council was called Parliament, and it was their job to help the king. But when Earl de Montfort gained control and booted out Henry III, he also decided to invite representatives from the areas, from the shires and from the towns, to be part of the council as well. Finally, now the common people could have a say in some of the decision making that the king was making, or the earl in this part. Later on, Edward I became the next king after he got rid of Earl. He made it even better by adding an equal number of people from each town or from each shire to stand and to be part of a representation in the parliament. Okay, then it became known as the model parliament. As you read, this was the next step in an effective check and balance between the representatives and the king. Later on, Parliament divided into 2 parts, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. I've got some pictures of what it used to look like and what it looks like now, so let's look.
Here is a picture of inside the Parliament building in the United Kingdom. Now the first part, the House of the Lords, is said to be made up of the nobles and the clergy. It has a total of 797 total seats and members. On the other hand, the House of Commons, which are the representatives of the people, has a fixed number of 650 members. Here's a current picture of it.
Edward III had a pretty good setup for his government going at home. Despite all that, though, war broke out between France and England, and it was called the 100-Year War. Now, funny enough, it wasn't 100 years long. It was actually 116 years long. Needless to say, go ahead and watch your next video. It's called History of England, 100-Year War, and then come back to me. Now, as your book had said, England's defeat in the 100-Year War was a blessing in disguise, so losing wasn't such a bad thing, we found out later. With no sufficient amount of land on the European mainland, England could now concentrate on its internal development as a nation state, okay? And they did concentrate on their nation state by battling it out for the next 32 years. That's how we fix everything. We fight. Yay! Okay, so for 32 years, finally, in 1485, after the Battle of Bosworth Field, when Henry defeated the very last York ruler, he became King Henry VII. But, you know, even with their dependence, their powerful nation state, their individual rights and liberties, the common law, the trial by jury, and the limited monarchy, and their representative government and their parliament, England still was going to have a struggle for freedom, which you will see played out in the coming chapters.
As we leave the British Isles, we'll head on over to France by the Bay of Biscay. Here's a picture of it. It is known for its fierce weather and abnormally high waves that occur during the spring. France is also known for its beautiful gorges. This is the Vernon Gorge. It's in southeastern France. Here is a picture of Mount Puget, which is actually, the long story short, Latin for podium, an elevated place that is designated for superiority. These are beautiful mountain peaks. They are part of the Massif Central, okay, which means it's a narrow, steep, walled inlet made of limestone, dolomite, or carbonate strata. Here are the Pyrenees Mountains. They separate France from Spain. And here are some just other features that you can find as you travel through France.
All right, so welcome to France. So let's start back at the beginning. For this nation, not all the way beginning, like not creation beginning, but let's start back at when Rome was falling apart and the Franks came in and took over this area, and that's why it's named France, is after them, okay? The Capetian line of kings started with Hugh Capet in 987, and that marks France's modern nation's beginning, okay? Hugh chose Paris to be the center of his domain. Later on, Philip II built the Louvre Castle before leaving on the Third Crusade. Now, remember what I just talked about in England, how Richard I, or Richard the Lionheart, was gone during his 10 years of reign over fighting the Crusades. Well, he brought Philip II from France with him to fight, okay? But before Philip left, he built these big walls around Paris to protect it because it had several weak points, okay? And it was completed around 1202. Let's take a minute and look at the pictures of the Louvre Castle. And then I have a picture of the Louvre Palace. And then it became the Louvre Museum. So let's take a minute and look at these pictures.
Here's a sketch drawing of the Louvre Castle that was designed and built by Philip II for protection. Here's an actual wall that was left when the castle was torn down, and when the Louvre Palace in the 14th century by Charles V was built. At first it was a fortress and then it became a royal palace. Now part of the Louvre Palace is a museum.
Something I forgot to mention was I did say that part of the Louvre Palace became a museum, and that happened in 1793. And it's an art museum, and it houses thousands of artifacts and art things. And so later on, when we get to that part of history, the 1700s, I've got some pictures because a friend of mine's mom went to France and Spain and sent me a bunch of stuff. So I can't wait to share that with you, but that'll be later. Moving on along. Okay, so remember, Rome has a special interest in France. Okay, because remember Pepin, the mayor of the palace, and how he just didn't want the job of being in charge. He wanted the title that went with it, i.e., king, instead of the Merovingian kings that were just like the fake front kings. Okay, remember him? All right, and so the Pope said that he could be king, Pepin the Short. And then when the Pope in Rome was having problems by the Lombards who were taking over, in rushes Pepin, who's now king, and he conquers the Lombards, and the land that he took from them, he gave to the Pope as the Papal States. Remember that, you guys? Okay, making the Pope a temporal ruler. Temporarily, he was in charge of the land that Pepin donated to him. Okay, now fast forward back to where we are today. Okay, the power struggle between later on King Philip IV and Pope Boniface VIII. On a side note, I had to know what Boniface meant. It was killing me because I know that the popes take on a name of somebody they admire or some sort of characteristic that they want to live up to, and so I had to know what Boniface meant, because doesn't it make you wonder? It is Latin for good fate or doer of good. So if you can't remember what Boniface did, you can go back and look in your chapter and tell me if that's an appropriate name for him. I hope that's not too brass. But anyway, okay, so however, the problems that King Philip was having with Pope, it finally came to the point where exchange of taxes and gold and you're not going to be king anymore and oh yes I am and all that nonsense was going on. And I know I talked about that already, okay? Philip had enough of it and he had the Pope arrested and brought back to France, and then Philip put in his own archbishop, okay? So the point of all the story was that during this conflict problem, the Estates General, which is the French version of Parliament, was called or began. Okay, and so I have a picture of what the Estates General looks like. Parliament was divided into two sections. Okay, we just looked at that. Well, the States General is divided into three departments. And so let's take a second and look at what that looks like. And then we'll talk some more about France. Okay, so the general estate later on will have a breakup and it will kind of fan the flames of the revolution, but we'll talk about that later. Right at this point, though, at the beginning of it, they didn't have any real say. Yes, they were supposed to be there to help the King of France make decisions and laws, but that's not kind of what happened, okay? So they were only really there to submit to the king's will and to approve his laws. They couldn't really naysay it. They just had to say, okay, yeah. And at present, the king had kind of ultimate cosmic power. He didn't have a check and balance system very well developed like England did, okay? Yeah, it wasn't so great, okay? 100-year war erupted after a royal change in succession with the reign of the French House of Valois. Yet, after the war, even though France gained much land by annexing it in um, from what was captured and demonstrating strong features as a nation state, it still lacked advancement towards political freedom due to the absolute power of the French monarchy and the limited representation of the government. And as the modern age began, France had its work cut out for itself.
Welcome to the Iberian Peninsula, home to Spain and Portugal. Now, this continent is closest to Morocco at 8.1 miles with the Strait of Gibraltar pictured here. Here's a picture taken from Spain looking across the strait to Morocco. And here's a port in Morocco. These next few pictures were taken by my friend's mom, Mrs. Gilchrist, when she went to Spain. Here is one of the famous palaces in Granada, and here is some artwork found inside the palace of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella.
All right, so Spain is a little bit of a short section in your reading for this week, so I thought it would be fun to just watch a video kind of recapping the few paragraphs or page that you had to read about Spain. And so when you watch the video link that I sent you for Spain, it's about Granada. It's a little bit different. You'll go to the link, but then at the top of the page it says, "Welcome to Classroom Europe with Rick Steves." Then just scroll down till you actually get to the video setting with the guy on it, the play button, you know. And it'll say Granada on the top corner. Go ahead and play it. The video is 6 minutes and 24 seconds, but it's a little bit different because it's not a YouTube video. But go ahead and watch it. Pay attention to the architecture in Spain. Oh my word, people. It's amazing. And then come back to me. After the Spanish took back the land from the Moors, then the infamous Spanish Inquisition started. That was not very lovely, to say the least. Nevertheless, it happened, but you guys have read about that already in your reading. At the dawn of the modern age, Spain's power as a new nation was just as powerful and absolute underneath the monarchy as France, and soon had itself involved in all sort of political arenas throughout the European continent. Okay, I was going to talk about Portugal, but it was really short as well, and so I figured I would say that for next week when we talk more about Portugal and Spain and what they're really known for, especially since the Inquisition was in, or the Reconquest was ended in 1492. And what happens in 1492, people? In 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. So stay tuned for next week when we look more into Spain and Portugal and chapter 14. All right, people. So do you realize we've got one more week together and then it is Christmas break? Hooray! All right. So the last week after this one, when I'm done talking with y'all, is high school week. And that is when your projects, your end of semester projects are due. So don't forget, they're due on High School Friday. Hello, Hammer Robbie. It's been quite some time. Thank you for joining me, guys, and I will see you next week.
Adios.